Hello and welcome into a bonus episode of Locked On Wolves. Karl-Anthony Towns to the Knicks. Julius Randle, Donte DiVincenzo to the Timberwolves. Why? What just happened? What does this mean for next year in the future? It's all coming next.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Saturday, everybody. This is a bonus episode of Locked On Wolves, a semi-emergency podcast. This trade went down just over 12 hours ago. And through a flurry of tweets last night and, sleeping on it. And this is, we'll call this a semi-emergency pod. I think that's fair to say. I don't have fully formed thoughts yet, but I want to react to what we've learned in the last 12 hours. In fact, the trade's not official yet. It hasn't been announced by the team. We still don't know the exact details. There's reports that there's more players involved, et cetera, the third team. We don't know all of that. So this is I'll get to all that Monday. This is an immediate reaction to what happened and what my initial take is on this trade for the Wolves. So we're going to get to all that here on the show. A big thank you if you do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, you can find this show anywhere. You can watch on YouTube. You can watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, which you can find on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And, of course, you can also follow along on Twitter. If you're watching on YouTube, the handle's there at the bottom of the screen. All right. So here's what we know so far. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because, again, we don't have all the details yet, at least not finalized. We know Cat is going to the Knicks. We know Donte DiVincenzo and Julius Randle are coming to Minnesota. There's a report that Keita Bates-Diop will come to Minnesota. I think John Krasinski of The Athletic reported that. And also a top 13 protected Pistons pick comes to Minnesota. More on that in a minute. My initial reaction is this trade, obviously, the Knicks have been chasing this for a while. We've heard Cat to the Knicks for a long time because of Leon Rose, the agency connection. And then the last couple of years, Gerson Rosas going from a consultant there to now a formalized front office position, a primary decision maker in the Knicks front office. We know that Rosas gets what Rosas wants. I'm strictly speaking basketball now. Rosas gets what Rosas wants. And it was D'Angelo Russell in Minnesota, and it's now Karl-Anthony Towns in New York. We know that Tibbs has been more than open to working with Cat again after working with him in Minnesota. And that I think those issues were overblown a bit back in the day. So that's number one. And all reports out there right now, including from John Krasinski and others, I think Jake Fisher was on this as well. The Timberwolves became open to this idea when Donte DiVincenzo was put on the table by the Knicks. And I'm going to spend a lot of time the next week talking about DiVincenzo because I think he's actually the key to this deal. Julius Randle is hey, we need somebody to fill Cat's role on the team. But DiVincenzo is the one that's headed into his prime and had a career year last year and is under a very team-friendly contract. So I think ultimately he's the key to the deal. I don't want to bury the lead too much here. I do not like this trade for Minnesota. I don't. If you've been following along on Twitter, on X, I've said as much. I don't like the trade for Minnesota. In short, I think it makes the team worse this year. It hurts them on both ends of the floor. How much worse, we don't know. It may not be significantly. I could be a little bit dramatic about this, which is not, if you're a regular listener, I'm pretty even keel about stuff. I try to call it like I see it. Obviously, this is another conversation, but maybe I should start here. The Cat being in Minnesota for 9 years and seeing him grow as he has with the Timberwolves, that's obviously, from a fan standpoint, that's tough to see Cat move on. And, there will be a time and a place for kind of a memories of Cat in Minnesota podcast. And I'll definitely do that. That's not what this is, but I should say that setting that aside, I don't like it from a basketball standpoint either. I think the reason for doing it, and then I'll explain why I don't like it, is clearly because they want to control costs. I don't want to say cut costs. Well, it will help the luxury tax bill this year. I don't think that's the sole reason for it. Because remember, they could have cut costs they could have cut salary, I should say, at any point during the year. The luxury tax bill doesn't become due until the end of the season. So they could have made a trade at the deadline. They could have made a trade on the last day of the league year. Or I guess technically you couldn't after the deadline, but they could find a way to cut salary up until then, right? Like it didn't have to be done now. I mean, it does save a little bit, right? Because you're more salary out than salary in, but in terms of the penalty, right? The luxury tax penalty. I think it's more for, it saves a little bit this year, but it saves a lot more next year. And if you compare the two salaries, like I don't want to get too in the weeds on this right now because I want to focus on the basketball side, but I think it's important to lay out why they're doing this, right? Julius Randle makes $30 million this year and Cat makes $49 million this year. So $19 million less. But next year, Cat makes 53 and Julius Randle makes essentially 31, but it's also a player option. Cat just signed the Supermax last year that kicks in this year. So like Cat's player option isn't for another 3 years. Julius Randle's is next year. It lines up with Rudy Gobert's. So both Julius Randle and Rudy Gobert are now extension eligible. They both have player options for next year. And the Timberwolves could choose to extend one or both of them at a more team-friendly deal. Gobert being a couple years older than Randle, Randle being a couple years older than Cat. So it does give them more flexibility. It does give them more wiggle room, if you want to call it that, for the short term and for the long term. Because now you're not locked into these Cat years. And also, like, in a sense, I don't know. I don't know that we'll ever know this, but maybe Cat's playoff run and how well he defended, maybe that helped the Knicks say, okay, we'll put DiVincenzo on the table. Because the Wolves, this deal undoubtedly was on the table for a while, but with pieces other than DiVincenzo. And he was the linchpin to this whole deal. And perhaps it was a bit of a sell high with how Cat, I know the conference finals didn't go to plan, but how Cat defended Durant, how Cat defended Jokic. Perhaps that convinced Tibbs, Rosas, the Knicks to say, all right, Cat showed us something here. We'll include DiVincenzo. Because it does give the Wolves that flexibility, that optionality. And along with that, I think this is directly related, more than just the cost cutting, is it extends the Ant window in theory. Now, what that means is you're hitching your wagon to some combination of Jaden McDaniels, Naz Reid, Rob Dillingham, and DiVincenzo, that like 2 to 3 or more of those guys become true star level contributors. That's what you're banking on. Because Karl-Anthony Towns was that. Set aside some of the immaturity stuff, set aside the offensive fouls, set aside disappearing in the conference finals, whatever you want to complain about with Cat. He's the best player in this deal, and it's not close. It's not close. He's a significantly better player than Julius Randle. But what this does is it, in theory, it's like a lottery ticket. It's like when you trade for a bunch of lottery picks and you hope you hit on one of them. It's like the actual tangible NBA player, like we know who we have version of that, which is better because you at least have the data on, like, obviously McDaniels has been in their building. Obviously Naz Reid's been in their building. They think highly of Naz Reid, of course. So you're banking on one or both of those guys taking that next step. You're banking on DiVincenzo or Rob Dillingham. Now, obviously Dillingham's 19. DiVincenzo's headed into his prime right now and had a breakout year last year for the Knicks. They're different players, but can DiVincenzo become like a true second or third scoring option? I don't necessarily buy that, but like he's a fantastic glue, and we'll spend a lot more time on DiVincenzo. I don't want to get off the rails here too early, but the point that, like, that's the argument for the trade. That is what Tim Conley and the Timberwolves are thinking. Is yes, it saves us a little money in the short term, it saves us a lot of money in the long term, and it gives us more optionality over the next couple of years. And it allows us to see what we have, right? Like, this is Naz's effectively another contract year. He's got a player option for next season for $15 million. And unless, God forbid, he gets hurt this year or something, he's not picking that option up. He's going to opt out because he's going to get more on the open market from the Wolves or someone else. And yes, it gives the Wolves the opportunity to pay him. If Naz this year has just an unbelievable season, he's going to stay in Minnesota now, and they're going to pay him. I'm dubious on that a bit, and I'll get into that too, because I think there's a point of diminishing returns with Naz Reid. That's probably unpopular, and maybe I should have said that this early in the show. Like, I worry about Naz getting overextended. We'll talk about that too. I want to talk about Julius Randle, the differences between he and Cat. We're going to keep this show a little bit shorter. I'm going to be back on Monday with more reaction. We're going to do a crossover episode with Locked On Knicks. I'll be on Locked On NBA. There's going to be tons of content over the next couple of days. This is meant to be a rapid reaction. So we'll get to the next piece of this, the Randle piece of this, Randle versus Cat, I guess, if you will. We'll get to that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves today's very special bonus episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Game Time. Game Time is the best place to get tickets for live events. They have a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals and great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. No matter what the live event is you want to head to, you can find those tickets on Game Time. And plus, Game Time Picks will curate your choices to make it easier to save more on all those live events. Of course, sports, but also concerts, comedy, theater, etc. I love all sporting events. I love any sort of entertainment. My wife and I go to theater. We'll go to comedy shows, etc. You can find it all on Game Time. You can also toggle on their all-in pricing feature when you're looking for tickets. That will show you your total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Again, make sure to toggle on the all-in pricing feature. And my favorite thing is the seat views. Get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKDOWNNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. All right. So the basket. So, okay. Where I start here is they did this. I've laid this out, right? Cut a little bit of cost this year, cut a lot of costs long-term, give themselves some flexibility longer term, extending Ant's window because the window is such a weird term to use for somebody who's like 23, but like Cat was obviously 5-6 years older, right? So now you align this with Jade McDaniels, you align it with, DiVincenzo's roughly the same age, a year younger maybe than Cat. But you align yourself with McDaniels, you align yourself with, to a lesser extent, Rob Dillingham, Naz Reid. This is the core moving forward. This is the choice you're making if you're the Timberwolves. And as I mentioned, DiVincenzo tips the scales. We got to talk about the Randle piece because, again, and this is what I've said on Twitter, and this is what I keep going back to. I think this trade makes the Timberwolves worse this season. I don't think there's any question about that in my mind. And I can make I understand the argument for them being better, and I'll address that in a moment. I think it makes them worse. It may not make them a lot worse, but it doesn't matter. If you go to the conference finals and you make an active choice to make the roster worse the following year, that's a mistake. That's a tough pill to swallow for the fan base, especially you layer in all the other stuff. A guy who's been here 9 years, a guy who's paid his dues, a guy who's has made progress, sacrificed for the team last year, all the above. That makes it even tougher. It may not make them a lot worse this year. Julius Randle's a good player. He's I think, 3-time All-Star. He, in theory, has a similar offensive skill set to Karl-Anthony Towns. In theory, the execution, the result of what Julius Randle does is not nearly as efficient as Karl-Anthony Towns. Don't lose that. I get that he was in the three-point contest. I didn't understand it at the time. I think I made fun of it on the show. Like, why is he in the three-point contest? Julius Randle is not a three-point shooter. He had one season over 40%. That was his first All-Star year. It'll be 5 years ago this fall. Was the only time he shot over 40%. He doesn't have a single season that he's been above 34.5% outside the arc. Besides that season, he was 31% last year. So don't miss that. In theory, yes, he can shoot threes. He can rebound. He can put the ball on the floor and score. None of it's as efficient as Karl-Anthony Towns. There's two things that I would say he does as well or slightly better than Karl-Anthony Towns. He's always had a better free throw rate. He's a bully with the ball in his hands, which is awesome. It's great to have somebody that can knock guys over, that can, not in this. Let me rephrase that. I realize we're talking about Karl-Anthony Towns, who literally knocked guys over and led the league in offensive foul rate for the last several years, basically. Julius Randle's better at being physical and drawing fouls instead of getting fouls called on him. That's a massive positive. That, to me, is the biggest thing. You could also argue he's a little bit of a better passer. The assist rate's usually been more consistent for Julius Randle. He's been a variety of different roles offensively. But to me, the biggest thing he would bring is, instead of the offensive fouls that Cat committed, you're drawing fouls. Julius Randle's better at that. Now, Julius Randle also had an identical turnover rate as Karl-Anthony Towns last year. So he went about it in a different way, but you're not necessarily cutting turnovers by trading Karl-Anthony Towns. Everything else, Julius Randle's just not as efficient. He can stretch the floor. He can face up and score. That's where he's most dangerous, is when he can face up and get to the basket. So, again, I'll say it this way. It's a similar offensive skill set in theory. He's going to fill the Karl-Anthony Towns role offensively, basically, in theory. In execution and result, to this point in Randle's career, it's nowhere near as efficient as Karl-Anthony Towns. And when he's on the floor with Rudy Gobert, that spacing is not great. And I understand it. I've seen all the comments on Twitter. People responding to me saying, look, the spacing wasn't good last year for the Wolves. Okay. It's not going to get better. That's not when you have the 16th best offense in the league and your spacing is poor, but every shooter on every guy you have in your rotation now, except for Rudy Gobert, is a plus 3-point shooter, and your spacing was poor. That's not great, but it could get better. But if you take away your best shooter and you replace him with who's now the worst shooter on the roster besides Rudy Gobert, your spacing's not getting better. I don't care how bad it was last year. It doesn't make any sense. Saying that something is bad doesn't mean that that making it actively worse is a good thing. I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense to me. How anybody could argue with a straight face that like, oh, the spacing was bad last year, so this doesn't matter. No, it does matter. It doesn't change that at all. Again, I'll go back to the positive with Julius Randle. Julius Randle playing bully ball, Julius Randle being aggressive, Julius Randle bringing an edge. All that is good. I'll take it. It's less aesthetically pleasing to watch compared to Karl-Anthony Towns, even if Karl-Anthony Towns at times was very herky-jerky and awkward, and you're holding your breath hoping he doesn't commit a dumb offensive foul. But the dude's an efficient offensive player. He's a very efficient offensive player. And the other thing is Karl-Anthony Towns, I've alluded to this earlier, he sacrificed in terms of his role on both ends of the floor. But offensively, this is a dude that was the offense for years. Had usage rates of 29+% for like 3-4 straight seasons, and has seen that role diminish slightly the last couple of years. And other than like early 21-22 or early 22-23, when there was a bit of a my turn your turn, as Chris Fitch called it, a take turn offense between Ant and Cat, that kind of went away to an extent last year, and they found a pretty decent groove. Julius Randle, this is a guy who's had a usage rate of over 29%. The last 4 seasons, hasn't had a usage rate below 27.5% since 2017-18. And Karl-Anthony Towns has sacrificed. Karl-Anthony Towns was able to be that other offensive piece that could catch and shoot, let it fly from 3, play off of Ant. Now, like the only way, and the best version of this is like if Ant's the dude that the offense is revolving around, and he is, and Ant's putting his head down, getting to the basket. Ant is the one who's drawing the defense. You could kick it to Julius Randle, and he can take advantage of a sloppy closeout and get to the basket and do damage, draw fouls. I get that. He's a better passer than Cat, so maybe he makes the right play and he does swing the ball. But nobody's closing out hard to Julius Randle like they closed out to Karl-Anthony Towns. Like, that, to me, is the thing. Like, if the Ant kick out is to Cat, they got to close out hard on Cat. And he's either letting it fly or he's going to the basket or he's hopefully making the right play, sometimes making the wrong choice, turning it over. I get it. But with Julius Randle, that's not a closeout to the touch. That's a yellow closeout, right? That's not a get in his face. That's a closeout with caution, because you don't need to sell out on a guy. What did he shoot? 31% last year? Is that what I said? I'm on the wrong one. I think it was 31% last year from 3. Yeah, 31.1%. I'll tell you who they're not closing out hard to is a 31% 3-point shooter. That, to me, is the biggest issue. You don't solve bad spacing by making it worse, by adding worse shooters. Now, the DiVincenzo piece, to me, and I'll mention the draft pick here in a minute too. I don't care as much about that. Like, it's nice, but it's heavily protected. It's not the sweetener that got this done. It may have been we need it or it's not happening, but DiVincenzo was the linchpin of this. I want to talk about that here next, and then we'll close the show. Today's bonus episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. If you're an NFL fan, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Big NFL Sunday this week. And, of course, Packers-Vikings is a ton of fun. I think I said the other day, I'm not touching the line on that one, but there's some good ones out there that I would take a look at for NFL. Also, pay attention to what the Wolves win total does. I haven't actually, I don't think it's done anything yet. But remember, it was 52.5 before the trade. I'm pretty interested to see. Actually, let's see if I can pull this up real quick. Pretty interested to see what this looks like now in the wake of this trade. Now, it's not official, so it's possible that the line that they've pulled down win total lines for both the Wolves and the Knicks, but we'll see here. Let's see. Minnesota is still 52.5. on FanDuel, and the Knicks are 54.5. I actually think that's gone up a little bit, I believe. So are the Knicks 2 wins better than the Wolves? Probably, because they're in the Eastern Conference. We'll talk about that more later when we do final season projections. But check that out. Check out NFL stuff for this Sunday. Again, if you get a hunch in the middle of the NFL game, you can check out the latest stats, live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Again, that's over at FanDuel, FanDuel.com. All right, the DiVincenzo piece. This is obviously not going to do it justice. This is a very short kind of delving into who DiVincenzo is a player. I think he is the swing piece to this trade. Donte DiVincenzo has long been a very impactful rotation player at the NBA level, really from day one. Of course, was a winner at Villanova. Everybody loves that. But he's been an impactful player regardless of where he's been. He was really good with Milwaukee early in his career and was solid in Golden State a couple years ago, and then signed a deal with the Knicks. So reportedly, the Timberwolves were very interested in him in free agency. His contract is a legit steal. It's $11.5 million this year, $12 million next year, and just $12.5 million the year after that. So it's 3 years of team control through his prime. Okay, Donte DiVincenzo is 27 years old. He turns 28 the end of January. Okay, so they get him through his age 29 to 30 season. So his prime is in Minnesota. Last year was the breakout year. The first year since 2021 in Milwaukee, where he was a regular starter. He averaged 15.5 points per game last year, shot over 40% from three. And guess what? 70% of his shot attempts were three-pointers. Like, he's hunting threes. He doesn't need the ball in his hands to do other stuff. He's just happy to shoot threes on you all day. He's not going to get to the line. He's not going to put the ball on the floor and score a ton in the paint. But he's an efficient offensive player, and he's a really good defender. We'll talk more about that later, but adding another perimeter defender, some of what he does is redundant to Nickeil Alexander-Walker, but he's a better player than Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and he's smaller, right? He's more of a true combo guard, whereas Alexander-Walker is more of a 2 and a 3's body. And certainly I would say more volatile in terms of what he provides from outside the arc. DiVincenzo he's improved every year as a three-point shooter. He was like low 30s early in his career, low 30%, 38% 1 year Milwaukee. He dipped the year he split between Milwaukee and Sacramento, but then 40% in Golden State, 40.1% last year for the Knicks. He's a 40% volume three-point shooter. That is super valuable, and that is going to help the spacing. And I guarantee you that part of the calculus here is, hey, we think Jaden's a better shooter than he was last year. We think DiVincenzo's a fantastic shooter. We think Ant is obviously very dangerous. We could put some of these other guys, DiVincenzo, a more dangerous McDaniels, the threat of Randle, facing up and driving to the basket around Ant, and the spacing will be okay enough. And I think DiVincenzo does enough other things that I'll go back to what I started with here. I do think this trade makes them worse this year, but I don't know how much worse. If DiVincenzo, who's legit now in his prime, is going to be a 15 point per game scorer and shoot, what did he shoot? How many threes per game did he shoot last year? He shot a ton. He shot like 9 threes a game. Yeah, just under 9 threes a game last year at 40%. They may not be a lot worse. I could just be wrong about how much worse it's going to make them. But they're banking on, it's a dice roll. Like virtually everything is. Standing pat would have been something of a dice roll. I think a safer one. And one that would have made the baseline of the roster better this year. You're banking on DiVincenzo doing what he did last year with the Knicks, but maybe even a little bit better in age 28 season. You're banking on Jaden McDaniels being more like he was 2 years ago than last year outside the arc. You're banking on Julius Randle being able to play with a really high usage perimeter player in Anthony Edwards. You're banking on Naz Reid. Well, I don't have a chance to talk much about Naz today. I'll briefly address this. I've seen people talk about Naz starting. I don't think that happens. You could make the argument that Naz starts next to Rudy and he plays the quote unquote cat role, and Julius Randle comes off the bench and he's just a bowling ball off the bench. And like he did some of that early in his career with the Pelicans and was more of a 6-man type. They might do that. It's completely on the table, but I'd be really surprised if they took a 3-time All-Star who was just on the All-Star team last year, who's in his prime, Julius Randle, and going to have the ball in his hands less than he did with the Knicks, and just say, hey, by the way, Julius, mind if you come off the bench? I think that's probably going to rock the boat more, where Naz has a nice groove coming off the bench. I think the most likely scenario is Julius Randle's the starter. Naz comes off the bench, but he sees his minutes go up, and Randle's playing less minutes for the Wolves than Cat played for the Wolves last year, because Naz is a better, more synergistic fit between Rudy and Anthony Edwards. There's some stuff Naz has to clean up. And I mentioned this in passing at the beginning of today's show. I do have some concern about diminishing returns with Naz as he sees his minutes increase. I do. And I know that's not a popular sentiment. We got to see Naz do it more from outside the arc. Last year is the outlier for Naz Reid as a three-point shooter. We have to see more consistency there. We have to see Naz. The defense, I thought, improved a lot the last couple of years. That needs to stay. That can't go away with more minutes. Does that go away if he has more minutes and more workload? Perhaps. We'll get more into this next week. But I worry that there's a lot of NBA players that are great in their role, but as soon as they get a few more minutes, they become less impactful for a variety of reasons, and it's different for every guy. I worry that Naz is one of those guys. And we're going to find out because, again, I think he still comes off the bench, but I think, how many minutes did he play last year? Like, I think he sees the workload potentially increase, and it's one of those where Julius Randle's the starter, but as the year goes on, especially, you start to see those minutes kind of even out a bit. Like, even if Randle's the starter, Naz might be playing in crunch time because of his shooting ability, his offensive ability, his flexibility as a player. Last year, he averaged 24 minutes a game. The year before is 18. The year before is 16. Like, he saw the minutes go up. I mean, Naz might average 26, 27, 28 minutes this year off the bench for the Wolves, whereas Julius Randle's the starter, but Naz plays crunch time. I absolutely could see that. Absolutely. I don't think Naz is this starter, though. I just think there's politics matter, if you want to call it that. You don't want to rock the boat too much. And so I think they've already done that, I guess. It would be the counter argument. Like, you've already traded away your second best player. You have to go to the conference finals. You've already rocked that boat. Why not rock it a bit more at the start of the year? So much to unpack here. The plan is I'm going to do a crossover episode with Locked On Knicks. We'll record that Sunday, so that'll be up on YouTube Sunday evening, and Monday morning will be on the podcast feed. So stay tuned for that. I'll be on the Locked On NBA show on Monday, probably some other shows, and then we will I'll spend next week, like, we'll probably do a whole show on DiVincenzo, do a whole show on Randle, unpack everything I just rattled off here today, basically take each segment and turn it into a show. Like, I've got a lot of additional notes and thoughts I didn't get to. So, but if I can leave you with anything, I'll give you the summary in case you missed it along the way here today. The too long didn't read version is the Timberwolves roster got worse. They did it, yes, for cap savings this year, but ultimately for more flexibility in future years. And they're banking on a combination of McDaniels, Dillingham, Naz Reid, DiVincenzo, 2 to 3 of those guys stepping up and growing and improving. McDaniels or DiVincenzo and Naz Reid in their primes now. McDaniels getting there. Dillingham as a rookie, a lot still on his shoulders, although in theory the DiVincenzo acquisition could take some off of his shoulders this year, allow him to come along a little bit more slowly because DiVincenzo can operate a bit if he needs to. Anyway, the roster got worse, add some flexibility moving forward. They did this to hopefully extend what should be a very lengthy Anthony Edwards championship window. I haven't talked at all about the Knicks' impact. I think the Knicks got better. That starting five is unbelievable for the Knicks. It definitely is. So, lot to get to next week on the show. Be sure to tune in Sunday evening on YouTube, Monday morning on the audio feed for my conversation with Locked On Knicks. We'll do a crossover episode that'll run on both of our feeds then. Big thank you for tuning in to the special bonus weekend semi-emergency edition of Locked On Wolves. Big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day, including on this Saturday. Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Now make your second listen to Locked On NBA show, where the local experts keep you updated daily on all the biggest storylines ahead of the season. Again, I'll be on Locked On NBA with Jackson Gatlin on Monday. Find Locked On NBA at YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.